kind of monitor the chat and relay these questions to her, and then potentially kind of chime in if there was something that Tamara wanted, some addition on. But otherwise, it's really going to be her webinar tonight. And she has an awesome presentation set up for us and a lot of experience to back up the information you guys are going to see tonight. So I'll kind of let you take it from there, Tamara, and you just let me know, and I'll do my wave if there's some good questions that we want to get answered. But I'll give it over to you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much, Natalie. And thanks to yourself and to Cam for hosting me again. I'm really excited about this topic. I actually just finished a 6-week class on this exact topic. We also added in multiple hides because, there's only so much indication work you can do in a class, but it was so amazing. And frankly, I was blown away by just the progress that the teams made in 6 weeks. Most of those teams did not have an indication when they started. And some of those teams were retraining in indication. So, so it was a super mixed bag of students in terms of their skill and where they were at in their scent detection journey. But it was really cool to see all of the teams develop these really beautiful indications and clarify that communication. So I will be sharing some of that curriculum from that class here tonight. Nice. So, very briefly, a little bit about me. As Natalie mentioned, I'm the owner and instructor at CDT. We primarily focus on sport dog stuff, so competition obedience and sport detection. But we also have a growing sort of pet dog market as well, and do lots of puppy dog classes, and recently just added a reactive dog program. So Natalie will laugh at that because I was like, I don't do any BMOD. I only do sport detection. But anyway, here we are. So that's what we're up to at the business. But my passion definitely lies with sport detection, and it was definitely the catalyst for why I opened the business. I've spent a ton of time training with Ford Canine, first with Cam and then with Natalie. We've had Natalie out a number of times, and she's also going to be joining us again in the fall, this September. So I'm super excited about that weekend. I'm also a scent detection judge for the Canadian Kennel Club and also for CWAGs. And a lot of what led me to start down this path of really better understanding an indication and how to train that was for sure based on the young dog that I was training, but also just on so much of what I was seeing with the teams that I was judging. So most often people were failing for one of two reasons. Either their dog lacked the desire to hunt, and so they were having a hard time kind of just getting through the search area in the amount of time that they needed, or their dog lacked a little bit of desire. But really a lot of it was that the dogs lacked a very clear ability to communicate to their handler that they found the odor. And so as a judge, it's absolutely heartbreaking because we know what we know, and you see the teams go to the hide over and over and over and over, and the handlers are not calling it. And it's super frustrating for the dog. It's heartbreaking for the team. And it's clear that the dog knows his job. He's gone to odor multiple times, but the handler either just wasn't clear on reading that change of behavior, or maybe they just weren't confident to call it because, as it happens with, stress and all that kind of stuff while we're trialing, we do crazy things, right? So that's kind of really what led me down the path of trying to really understand how to train an indication. And my previous experience with training an indication, I actually started prior to the actual hunting part. So if you guys are following the odor pay system, you'll know that we don't start the indication until after our dogs are really hunting independently, right? We want them to be on their target odor and hunting pretty much in all of the components fairly independently before we're starting to add the indication. But my experience with my very first Doberman, or my very first dog, in sport detection, my Doberman Valor, we taught him his indication first, and we really just kind of glazed over the hunting part of it and all the skills, right? So it looked super sexy, he was really committed to going to odor, but if he couldn't find the odor to indicate on it, he was not really interested in working super hard for that. So that was my first experience. And then I got Vimy. He's my now 2-year-old short hair pointer. And that's really when I started working with Natalie more. And I just assumed that it would be super easy to teach this young, talented short hair all the things about sport detection, but it's actually been quite the journey. I've learned a lot about myself and about training a dog that has a ton of hunt drive. And so that brings in some certain challenges that we have with our indication, because he's not really interested in communicating back or reporting back that he's found the hide. He's more just interested in hunting the area and doing his searches, right? So super different than my other dog, my Doberman, who was really keen on telling me all the things that he found, but wasn't really good at finding them, to like the dog I have now, who's like super keen at hunting, but like really doesn't want to take the time to talk to you about it. So very diverse. But anyway, so we're going to talk about all of those different things and like the systems that we use and the strategies that I've used to really finesse things with my short hair, but also with my students. We've had a ton of different dogs come through the facility, and all of them have really, really beautiful indications, and it's really not diminishing their hunt drive at all. So we're going to talk a lot about how we can make that happen tonight. Before we jump into it, I would love to see if you guys could just put in the chat, if you're competing in sports detection, what organizations are you competing in? So while you guys are doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about our systems here in Canada. So we have the Canadian Kennel Club, similar to the American Kennel Club in terms of like the rules and the structure. We don't have all the elements, like we don't have like handler and like buried and I think maybe AKC, Natalie, differentiates between vehicles and exterior as well. Yeah, so in Canada, we just have the three components. We have containers, interior, and exterior, and there can be anything in your exterior. So they don't really differentiate to say that you get vehicles or maybe buried or whatever, right? And we also have CWAGs, which is fairly popular here. I don't know, maybe some of you guys are doing some CWAGs. And then also we have the Sporting Detection Dog Association, so SDDA. And that organization is a little bit different than like what you guys would see in the States for NACSW for a number of reasons. But the main differentiator is this really big focus on having an actual trained formal response or an alert. Like we need to put that on our registration, and the dog needs to perform a certain behavior. Otherwise, there could be point deductions if the dog doesn't perform that behavior when they get to odor. And so I think that's really what has driven me to perfect my indication more so than any other reason, because I want to be competitive when I go out, and I don't want to lose points arbitrarily just for something that I probably could have trained, right? So let's just have a look and see what you guys are all doing. Oh, so many of you guys, cool. So NACSW, AKC, lots of NACSW training for cadaver, awesome. SDDA, cool. NACSW, AKC, oh, narcotics detection and American Schutzen, that's super cool. Jane, hey, one of my students. Welcome, Jane. She does CWAG, CKC. Oh yeah, United Kennel Club is also another one that's getting like fairly popular around here. So we have UKC as well. SDDA. Yeah, so I would say probably it's a big split between like AKC and NACSW, which is probably no surprise given the audience. So I don't think in NACSW, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Natalie, but we definitely don't have that same pressure to have this like trained final response, right? Like you guys can call based on change of behavior.
Correct.
Yeah, cool. And that's great. And I like our other organizations also, like CKC, CWAGs, all that kind of stuff. We can also call on change of behavior, but we'll maybe get into a little bit here shortly about why we might want to reconsider that and why maybe we would want to have a trained final response. So what we're going to talk about tonight is demystifying the indication and just really understanding what that's all about. Talking about some pros and cons, because there's no behavior without a consequence, right? So we really need to understand what that's about before we get into it. Talking about some of the prerequisites. So what do you as a team need to have, and what does your dog need to have as skills before we recommend starting to train your indication? And then we're going to jump into the strategies for developing the indication. So when Natalie and I first were talking about this webinar, we were going to do developing and proofing your indication. And then there was so much material that it just was not possible to fit it all in an hour. So we're going to do a part 2 to this. So the strategies that we're going to teach you now are like kind of like the groundwork that you're going to be doing to like start shaping that indication. And then in part 2, we're going to talk about how we bridge the gap of like taking these behaviors and putting them into the searches, and like how we can still be cultivating motivation, independence, confidence, all that kind of stuff in our search dogs. All right. And we'll leave a little time for Q&A. So if there's stuff that you guys want to answer or answered, throw it in the Q&A. Natalie will monitor that as we go. And Natalie, if there's stuff that's pertinent to like what we're talking about right away, just feel free to flag me down.
Okay, sure.
Cool. All right. So who is this for? So definitely all nose work enthusiasts, or really anyone who's doing any sort of like detection with their dogs. Definitely dogs searching for target odor. We want our dogs to be fairly confident searching in like new areas and in different components and stuff like that. But the caveat to that is we don't want to leave it for too long. We don't want to go like a year of like having our dog search with no indication. Excuse me, without adding this in, because it can be a little bit hard, especially with our dogs who really love hunting, to kind of rein them in a little bit, right? And it's also really hard to continue working on skills if your dog doesn't have this ability to report back to you, such as like multiple hides, converging odor, things like that. It gets a little bit more challenging to call that based purely on change of behavior. So we really want our dogs to have confidence and independence on their target odor, but not so much history in just hunting and getting marked for change of behavior that it's going to be maybe a bit more challenging to add the indication in. So for my students, like usually once they've been through the intro class, and maybe like one more round of classes, maybe that's kind of when we're starting to add the indication in. So, and in our intro classes, like we're doing like basically step 0 and step 1 of the odor pace system. So it's really about like increasing or developing that hunt drive and then doing like the association to the target odor. And that's pretty much it. And we'll generalize that to like different areas and stuff, but that's pretty much what we're doing with our intro classes. So we're starting this pretty early. This is also really good for dogs that display either aggressive indications like pawing, scratching, things like that, or any other behavior that you might want to change. I've had clients that want to change their dog's pawing. It's not destructive necessarily, but they're putting their paws on things and it could cause problems. I've also had clients who want to change their dog's look back. So they're basically selected trained final response is that the dog will put their nose on odor and then look back at the handler. And there's lots of reasons why that might be okay for some teams, but also it can be a little bit challenging as you get to the higher levels, especially in the organizations that we compete with here in Canada, because you have an unknown number of hides in multiple areas, and it is a little bit challenging when your dog, and you have to clear areas. So it's a little bit challenging if your dog's looking back at you. Like sometimes you just take that as a signal that the dog is done searching or that there's nothing left or that they're indicating on odor, but that isn't the case at all. So I've had a few clients come and ask to change that as well. I've also recently, for my government and also another client, we changed the dog had like a standard like sit or down indication, and we changed it specifically to a freeze. And the reason for that again was like when we were at the lower levels, it wasn't really a big deal, but when hides were 4 feet above a stable surface, so they could be 6-7 feet above the ground, all of a sudden our dogs were a little bit confused about how to communicate to us that they found the hide. They would be kind of like dancing around, showing us lots of change of behavior, but because they couldn't put their nose to source and offer us that perfect sit or that perfect down, they were a little bit stressed. And we ended up, I multiple times with my Doberman when I was competing at Elite did not call hides because they were super high and he just was not giving me his trained final response. So I actually just recently retrained his, and it actually held up really well in trial this fall, or I guess this spring it was. And I was actually like, it was so good that I was kind of psyched out and didn't call the hide at first because I was like, oh no, what's happening here? But he did like a perfect freeze just with his like nose on the back of the car, and I called it and I was like, ooh, that was really scary. And then there was 3 hides in the area. The next 2, he did exactly the same way. So I was faster to call those 2, but it was really cool to see how like very little training started to have that stuff come together in trial as well. This is also for anyone who just wants to have better communication with their dog. So, clarity in communicating both ways, down the leash and up the leash, are really great for your sport detection teamwork. So this will help you with that. And it's great for anyone who wants to be able to confidently call alerts, not relying on that change of behavior to know whether your dog is specifically at source or not, especially for those organizations that really expect you to be, within a couple inches of the hide at the higher levels. So that's kind of who this is for. Let's talk a little bit about demystifying the indication. So in some organizations, and certainly with some methodologies out there, there is maybe a little bit of a stigma that like maybe the trained final response or the alert is not something that we want to train our dogs for, or that it's maybe not necessary. But in my experience, that has not been the case. I really find it super helpful for my students. It's super helpful for myself. And we'll talk a little bit how we can like train away from some of the pitfalls of this trained final response. But at the end of the day, this is a trained behavior that our dogs are doing to communicate that they have found the hide. So our change of behavior is something that the dog does sort of naturally when they get into odor, right? Everyone sees like an uptick in sniffing or a little bit of bracketing or a head snap or things like that. That's our change of behavior. That's sort of something that's natural, that's happening within the dog. The dog's physiology is like basically doing this. And that's happening anytime the dog comes into odor. But the trained final response, or the alert, as we often call it as well, is something that we are actually training, we are shaping, we are basically creating a cue with the odor for the dog to do this behavior when they find the hide and are finished sourcing the hide. So that's kind of the difference between the change of behavior and the alert or the trained final response. I call it an indication. It's kind of sciencey. It sounds sexy, but you can call it anything. You can call it an indication, trained final response, alert, whatever the case may be. We also, at least in the sport detection world, want to train as much as possible a passive indication, which means the dog is not making like forward motion towards the hide. They're not doing anything when they get to the hide. They're just like either sitting, downing, freezing, staring, whatever the case may be, whatever your choice is in terms of what you want that to look like. But the reason for that obviously is that dogs will get into a bit of trouble in the search area if they're starting to paw at things or bite at things or potentially bark at things. So at least from a sport detection perspective, we found that the best alert is just to train a passive one, and you're probably going to keep yourself out of trouble down the road. I think it's like anything in dog training where like our dog's drive comes up over time and as they become more proficient with the exercises and they become more confident in what they're doing. So typically when you have an active alert, which would be like that pawing or barking or something like that, you'll see that continue to increase in intensity as the dog becomes more confident in what they're doing. So if you see a little bit in the beginning, it's probably going to turn into a lot later down the road. So I want to show you guys a video of the change of behavior, and then we're going to look at some video that are specifically just the trained final response or the alert. Okay, so in this video, this is just me working Vimy actually from the last time Natalie was out. And he isn't indicating on the hides for like various like other problems that have nothing to do with his indication. He's a beautiful indication, but he was like lacking a bit of confidence in exteriors in that time. And we probably like in hindsight, like could have managed this differently because I knew that he was struggling with his confidence outside. But it's a really good video to show you his change of behavior because he totally knows where odor is, but you'll never see him like actually stop on it. So if you're looking at this like from a judge's perspective or a competitor's perspective, it would be super hard if the judge asked you where that hide was to be able to call it purely just based on change of behavior, because you'll see that it would be like almost impossible if you didn't know where the hides were to really be able to call that. So let's have a look here. So he has a change. He's starting to bracket there a little bit. I recognize he's an odor, so I bring him back because he doesn't give me his indication. And we leave because he's not ready to commit to that. So another change there, right? And he's definitely sourcing, like he's working the area, but he doesn't really ever commit to one specific spot on the boat or the ATV that's in front of it. So you can see like his change of behavior is super clear. If in the organization that I was competing in, I probably could call it on change of behavior, but it becomes a bit of a slippery slope because like how much of the change do you call it on, and like what are you reinforcing your dog for when that happens? So my criteria, regardless of the organization that I am competing in, is that my dog just stops with his nose as close to the hide as possible. So in this case, I'm not sure if you guys, can you see my mouse here? It's the hide's like really low down here in this like little wheel chalk. And in the ATV, it's up underneath the ATV cover. So he was definitely getting the odor, but just wasn't really sure how to commit to that. But just really good examples of that change of behavior. But definitely if Natalie would have asked me where like those were blind hides, like I would not have been able to tell you where those hides were other than within this area to this area, which like depending on the organization that you're competing with is going to be pretty far away, right? So contrast that with some really beautiful indications. These were actually just a couple of our students. So thank you guys for letting me use your video. But a couple of students that were just in a workshop that one of our instructors was teaching the other night. And you'll see, I'm just going to stop this one, how beautiful. She has a little change of behavior. The dog freezes beautifully. The handler is able to confidently call that, right? And then this is just another. So really, really lovely handling by both of these handlers here, giving their dogs lots of space. But what was really nice with the Aussie especially is that he did have a change of behavior on the wrong container, right? So he probably caught odor, like we have big overhead fans, so it's probably blowing odor everywhere. He caught the odor here. And if you were calling it based purely on change of behavior, you would have been wrong because he was like, and he looked at her like, oopsies, that's not quite right, and went to the right container, right? So super great for her. She knows what her dog's indication looks like. She didn't have to second guess that. And as soon as he went back to working, she stepped back, gave him some space, and he went into indication. So that's exactly textbook what we want to see happen with the dogs when they are have a trained final response. Okay, so why not reinforce the change of behavior? It's kind of a complicated topic, but really the way that I like kind of boil it down is we've all seen it in a trial and we do the blurt alert. Like Michelle with the Aussie in that last video would be a perfect example of how like she for sure, if she was doing it purely just based on change of behavior, she would have called that wrong container, right? The dog is still working. He was still sourcing. He was doing his job. She should not have been calling anything because he wasn't really at source, but she might have called that, right? And so I really think that we want to allow our dogs to continue sourcing and let them finish their jobs. If I call on Vimmy's change of behavior, he will completely ignore me. Full stop. Like, I am not done hunting. Please step back and let me do my job. Like, do not bother me, right? And so that a lot of dogs can get super frustrated too if they haven't already gotten to source. But in the end, really, we get what we reinforce. And so if we're always reinforcing the change of behavior, that behavior will become stronger and our indication will be diminished. So we don't necessarily always want to like indicate or mark directly on change of behavior because it's not always going to give us the result that we want. And we don't want to water down or diminish the sourcing behavior of our dogs, right? We also don't want them to just like start understanding that when we call change of behavior, the second they get into the scent cone, that they're at source, because you could have a dog that's working further and further away from source. And really what we want, especially for sport detection, this may not be the case in some of their professional detection realms, but for sport detection, we want to get as close to that hide as possible. So if we're always marking and paying the dog as soon as they come into that scent cone and we're not letting them really source, that could give them false expectations about what they're actually supposed to be there to do, right? Natalie, do you have anything to add about change of behavior and in terms of what you see and why we maybe wouldn't want to reinforce for that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the big thing with reinforcing change of behavior is if you're going to do it, you have to have something specific that you're working on, that you're purposely reinforcing it because you're addressing maybe another issue, like, you know, lack of confidence working. And like in Vimmy's video, I think that's like a perfect example, right? Like we should have marked him and paid him for that. And that's what we would have, that would have been fine, but that was okay. Yeah. And even for the professional handlers that are watching, and you guys already know the importance of having an indication, you know, we need it from the legal side of things. We need it to have our dogs have that really strong clarity, and we can't be doubting whether or not they were actually giving us that communication that they're at source. You know, so we definitely want to have that established behavior. There could be instances that we want to reinforce change of behavior, but typically when we already have an indication and we're working some other aspect that our dog needs some assistance on. But yeah, absolutely having that solid behavior. And obviously with this webinar, you guys kind of understand some of the value in that. Yeah, awesome. Cool. Thank you. All right. So when I start working with teams that didn't come through like our intro to detection program, so like they maybe started somewhere else or they started on their own or whatever, through no fault of their own, they say to me, but my canine has an indication.
And they may have an indication, but what happened was that was an indication that the dog chose. So in the absence of any information or trained behavior of any sort, the dogs, as clever as they are, want to communicate to us to earn reinforcement that, hey, human, the thing that I want to get paid for is over here. This is what you're looking for. And so sometimes the dogs will just choose a behavior. And like I mentioned earlier about like aggressive responses, these behaviors can get often quite strong. So at first it'll be like a sniff and a tiny look back. But then what I see happen with a lot of teams that have a look back, for example, is that like they're barely getting to the high, like they're almost like doing the look back as a change of behavior, right? Like they haven't really finished sourcing. They're like, oh, I'm an odor, look back, right? And so what ends up happening is that like that criteria is degrading because we don't really have an ability to communicate with the dog, like, hey, this is really what we're actually looking for from you. And so the dogs sort of like ad lib sometimes, right? The other thing that I see in trials a lot when I'm judging is that the dog will be like doing some sort of like behavior, like a look back or a paw, and like the handler won't call it. And so I'll say to them afterwards, like, hey, like it looked like your dog was communicating with you. Yeah, but that's not my dog's indication. Well, what was your trained indication? And they don't really have an answer for that, right? So what they've sort of been relying on all this time is this like uncanny ability for our dogs to try and communicate with us. And so they're just like trying to like hold up their neon sign that like, hey, I found this thing. But in the end, it's kind of just like morphed into certain things. And what I often have from people who didn't have formal trained final response is that like they'll end up getting some pawing, digging at the hide, biting at the hide, just because the criteria is just not clear to the dog, right? So that is a little bit of the risk with just sort of letting our dogs choose their own indication. It's why I go with a freeze, because that criteria I can be very clear with. When my dogs are choosing their own criteria, it tends to morph a little bit over time, and it can certainly get you into trouble because you are either unable to call it or unable to read your dog because they've done something that's kind of like out of their like typical behaviors. One thing about the look backs is that in the clear rooms, I find that handlers struggle with that a little bit, especially if you have a dog that's already a little bit handler focused, right? This isn't so much of a big deal. Like I have one client who's got a beautiful Portuguese water dog who like has hunt drive for days. And that dog's look back doesn't often get her into trouble because the dog hunts really independently. She doesn't ever look at the handler. Like she's doing really well and she has no problem reading her dog. Like I probably wouldn't change their indication. But for dogs who are maybe a little bit handler focused, or like certainly if they're struggling with blank areas and clearing areas and stuff like that, and that that doubt is sort of creeping into the team, then what you'll often see is a dog starting to kind of like look up at their handler or look back at their handler, like, I don't know what to do here, right? So they're still communicating with you, but in a way that isn't helpful in terms of like clearing an area, right? So that's what I see sometimes with the look backs, just kind of like some of that creeping in as you get to the higher levels when you're clearing. And also like with the biting and the pawing and all that kind of stuff, and the barking too, like barking just like makes your dog's arousal go like off the charts. Typically, like most dogs don't recover well from barking at something and then going back to searching. So even though it's not aggressive necessarily, it can kind of like knock your dog off their game a little bit. And for now, most organizations don't have a DQ, at least here in Canada, for rearranging the search area. In my opinion, it should totally change. As a host, we host a ton of trials. A friend of mine, and one of my instructors, we host a lot, and it's super frustrating when a dog comes through and just like bulldozes the area because they're pawing and digging and biting and everything, right? I hope that becomes a fault, or at least something like that in the future. But for now, it's not. But it'll be interesting to see if we see more people selecting away from these behaviors, if they're actually being judged on them. So yet to be seen. That's my italics sidebar. Okay, so I told you guys that there's pros and cons to everything, right? There's consequence to every behavior. So let's talk about that. So some of the cons, perhaps. One thing that I hear a lot, and this, I really got a lot of flack when I trained an indication for VIMI, because a lot of people have the belief that if your dog is giving false indications, it's because of the trained final response. But really what's happening is your dog is either like stressed or confused or doesn't know how to solve the problem. And so they're just giving that because it's been reinforced in the past, and that's how they know to get out of an area or how to end the search, right? So if we're seeing that, typically it's in like blank rooms. We can address that through training. The other thing that I see is, and this happened with my Doberman, I have absolute firsthand experience with this. If you overtrain or prioritize the indication, it can be extremely detrimental to your hunting. And the dogs aren't motivated then to hunt. It becomes, I think it was Cam that said this, but it's not called finding, it's called searching, right? And so we want the dogs to feel very motivated to search, and that like sometimes you'll find things and sometimes you won't find things, and that's okay. But if we over prioritize the indication early on and we don't have a dog that is intrinsically motivated to do the hunting, then as you get to the higher levels and like you have to clear these huge areas with like unknown number of hides and your dog's drive is diminished for that portion of the sport, then yes, then for sure having a very heavy focus on indication can be a big problem for you. But again, we can balance that out. So some of the pros that I see in terms of training and indication, number one, clarity, right? Clarity is kindness. We want to be able to communicate with our dogs as best as possible. And we want them to understand what's being reinforced. That's going to make your teamwork just so much better. Also clarity for you. So I love seeing teams that can go into a search area, have a beautiful search and confidently call alert and get out of there when the dog is finished sourcing and the handler totally knows what's going on. To me, that's very empowering for a handler, and I would love that for all of you guys to be able to feel that. We talked a little bit about this before, but by training an alert or an indication, you can have a reduction of unwanted behaviors at source. So we can get rid of that pawing, biting, barking, whatever it is that you don't want to have at source. You're also able to pinpoint the hide a whole lot better when your dog tells you, boom, it's right here. And that is really nice, again, at the higher levels when you're clearing areas and you have an unknown number of hides. And finally, I'm kind of vain. It looks cool and I love it. And I love training the indication. It's super, super fun. And I do it because I think that the clarity for me gives me so much less stress at a trial because I just know that my dog's going to do his job when he gets to source. I'm not trialing until this is all on stimulus control. So caveat all of that with that phrase is that like, I'm not doing this until this is on stimulus control. But for me, when I get to trial and my dog does that, there's no second guessing anything, right? My trial experience from my Doberman to my short hair has been entirely different. And I don't stand there in the search area scratching my head and wondering what's going on, right?
Tamara, can you just clarify for some of the people watching that maybe don't totally know what stimulus control looks like?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess just kind of to define stimulus control is that like our dogs are not offering a behavior unless it's been cued. And so the cue for our indication or trained final response is the odor itself, right? And this looks really, really messy for a while you guys are shaping these strategies that we're going to talk about. My short hair did not have his on stimulus control for a while, and he would just like walk around like pressing his face against the cupboards, like, and I would look at him like all awkward, and he would look at me all awkward, like, I don't know what's happening. I'm just doing this thing, right? So obviously there was no odor present. There was no reason for him to give that indication, but he has been reinforced for practicing those behaviors and training. And so he's just kind of testing it out, right? He's just like, oh, do I get reinforced for this? So at that moment in time, it was definitely not on stimulus control. But what I would expect to see from a dog that is trained, like basically trial ready, is that in the absence of odor, that you do not see that indication. That obviously comes with lots of other pieces around like your searching and your skill development and all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of how I define stimulus control in basically when it's applicable to odor. Does that answer things, Natalie? Cool. All right. So let's just talk about this for one very moment. I've had a number of clients come to me about reshaping their indication. It's harder than just training it from scratch, just like anything, right? When we're changing behavior, it's harder than shaping the new behavior. But even when you're shaping the new behavior, behavior. It gets kind of ugly for a while, like things kind of like deteriorate. It feels gross. Certainly some of my clients that were trying to change their indications were like totally like having a crisis, because they were like, oh my God, my dog is now not doing any of the things that they were supposed to be doing. They're not giving the look back. They're not giving a freeze, like WTF, Tamara. But it was one of those things that we just kind of had to like sit through the uncomfortable times for a little bit and just, you know, wait for the dog to kind of like figure things out and just keep pushing our progression plans forward. So far, very excited to say that all of those things have been improved for all the clients, but it does kind of feel a little bit gross for a while. The main two things that I think about when I am trying to sort of train through these like weird phases when I'm introducing the indication is always balance your hunting with indication. So what Natalie was saying earlier about how like maybe sometimes we would want to mark on first sniff, like if we were working on confidence, like that was a video of my baby dog being very like unconfident in the area. Like we should have just marked and like paid him for just being in odor and like trying to source it. That's one of those times where I should have prioritized like his confidence and his motivation over the indication. I got greedy, happens to all of us. But that's one thing that I really try to balance is my hunting with indication. So sometimes, you know what, if my dog hunted his ass off in a super distracting environment, I'm going to just mark on first sniff when he gets to odor. I'm like, boom, here's your reward. Like that was awesome, right? Like sometimes you still just want to reinforce the hunting, and sometimes you need to make sure that you're prioritizing that in your training plans. Or sometimes you just need to do it on the fly. You're like, wow, those hides were like remarkably difficult. That's not exactly what I expected to have happen. We've all done that. You go out and set hides and you think it's going to be super straightforward, and your dog spends like 7 minutes sourcing a hide, right? Pay the damn dog. Like, do not worry about your indication in that moment, right? So these are the things that like they're not like scripted, they're intuitive. And I think that's why people have a hard time with this, because sometimes you just need to like read in the moment what's happening with your dog and make a decision whether you're going to ask for the indication or whether you're going to pay for the hunting. The other thing too that really be like super cautious about as you guys are going through this process is split your criteria so that we're working on a specific or maybe two specific skills per training session. Like that's just good training. But really, I think sometimes in scent detection, we get a little bit lost in that principle of good training because we just go out and we like set some hides and we run them. And we're not really sure like the skill or concept that we're necessarily working on in that moment. So with my students, we always talk about that. Like, what is the skill that we're working on in this moment? What is it that we want to prioritize, right? If we're working inaccessible hides, for example, we're not prioritizing the indication, right? We're prioritizing that, like maybe the working of the inaccessible by the dog and maybe like any like fleeting commitment by the dog in that moment, right? So there's certain things that you're going to want to prioritize in each session, and just make sure you have a plan for that. That will help you get through all of these like sort of awkward periods where it feels like all the shit's falling apart. Okay. All right. So a couple times to not train your indication. So if you are working on your indication and also some other pieces of your sports detection training plan, keep these things in mind. These are kind of like the main things that I tell my students. So if you're introing a new odor, for example, and your dog's never been on it before, don't worry about duration. Just like do the association and get that paired and like give them lots of reinforcement for the new odor. And you can bring back the indication on that later. Don't worry about it in the moment. Often when we're training inaccessible hides, again, I'm classic for like getting super greedy and like wanting to see if my dog's going to give me that beautiful indication that he can give me on accessible hides. But a lot of times what happens is that we end up with a dog who's super frustrated and they're just going to either like leave source, which we don't want to have happen, or they're going to just like really be frustrated about the situation, right? So if they do say in the game, like bravo to them, but maybe don't prioritize your indication in those situations. And then anytime you're presenting some sort of context change, so that can be new areas, new search criteria, anytime that you're really trying to like build back confidence and motivation, don't focus on your indication. This will lead to reduced confidence and motivation. It's a huge conflict for our dogs. And once we have an indication, sometimes we do get greedy about it and we always ask for it. But as trainers, this is where like your intuitive thinking has to come in, and you need to know that like, hey, my dog did not look like his most confident self in this moment, so I'm going to go ahead and pay or mark on first sniff there. So those are the times when I'm typically not training an indication. And in all of these situations, I'm just marking on first sniff. Okay, so I just want my dog to have the belief that odor always pays. I might be marking early in that case. I might be paying on change of behavior, which we just said that maybe that could be a detractant from your indication, but this is all a balance, right? So if you're always just pushing one factor of your training forward, the other ones are just going to slip. That's just like the reality of training anything, right? You always, though, want to know where the hides are, especially when you're training these concepts, right? So I'm not going to go out and do a whole bunch of blind hides when I'm working on my indication. I'm not going to go out and do a whole bunch of blind hides when I'm working on my dog's confidence and motivation, right? So I want to know where those hides are so that I can mark precisely when my dog gets to where I want them to be, and I can initiate that reinforcement sequence. All right, speaking of markers, this is something that I talk about in every single one of my classes because nobody's on the same page about it. But hopefully everyone has a marker of sorts. So this could be verbal, it could be like a yes, it could be a click, a tone, whatever the case may be, but we want the mark to predict reinforcement, okay? And we want to be able to mark our dogs precisely when they get to where they need to be on the hide when they're finished sourcing. And without this precise marker, it's really challenging to communicate with our dogs that this tiny little nuanced precise behavior was what we wanted, right? So we need to be able to be really precise with our markers. If you do not have a marker, I'm not going to go into like a whole marker system thing here tonight, but if you don't have a marker, like reach out to us and we can like help you guys figure that out. If you want to implement a system, let's talk about that. But if you do have one, really just make sure that you're clarifying your markers, okay? So your mark should always be followed by reinforcement. And if you want to get like really particular about it, you can also have markers for like particular types of reinforcement. I know one of our instructors, Wendy, does. She has a food and a toy reinforcer. So you can do that, but you just need to train it into your system. One thing that Natalie and I worked on, and she was here to do a CSDT2 seminar, I guess it was in April. And one thing that we talked about at that time was introducing a location-specific marker. So in some of the videos coming up, you'll see that I'm marking with a clicker. That's what I prefer to use in sport detection. I think that like it takes the human factor out of communicating with your dog. I tend to be an emotional trainer, so I'm sometimes like, yes, or like if my dog did it really crappy, but I still have to reward them, and I'm like, yes. Like your dog knows, okay? So I use a clicker to like purely just take that out of it. And I love the accuracy of the timing of a clicker. So that's what I use. But in some of these videos, you'll see me clicking and like either having the dog reorient to me for food or I'm throwing the food away for him. But we've since gotten a little bit more specific about that. So now we have a location-specific marker. So click means come back to the handler for food. And I have a word called, I just named it sticky, which means stay at source and I will bring the food to you. So that helps build your duration up a little bit. Some dogs really do fine with just like leaving odor and going back to odor and leaving odor and going back to odor. But I find what ends up happening, especially with like these really like hunty dogs, is that they don't want to go back to odor, right? And so then like as soon as they leave odor, that's like a great excuse to just go back and go do hunting or whatever, right? And when we're building up the duration of our indication, it's nice to be able to just bring the food to the dog and have them have that clarity that like, hey, don't worry, the food's going to come to you. You just stay where you are. And you don't need to worry about reeling your dog back in and getting them back to source to pay them again and all that kind of stuff. It clarifies things a lot. So pay at handler is my click and pay at source is sticky. I haven't been teaching this a lot with my students, I will say. Primarily because your marker mechanics need to be pretty good. And if you don't have a really good understanding of your marker mechanics and like what that all means within like the whole reinforcement system for your dog, it can get messier or like do more harm than good. So I think that like this is maybe a bit more advanced, or if you're really struggling with like having a lot of duration at source, that might be something that I would implement. But everything that you'll see with Vimi's videos coming up, I did not have a location specific marker for. I'm throwing food, he's coming to my hand. Like he does figure it out. Dogs are really brilliant at like kind of like monitoring our gestural communication, but that can also be a hindrance if your timing isn't right on and you're like reaching for your treat pouch and stuff early, right? So clarity is kindness. Just figure out your marker system, make sure that you have something in place that your dog understands and that you guys can work with, okay? You definitely need this before you move on to any of these strategies. So without a marker, it would be super, super challenging to train a lot of these strategies. Okay, so some of the foundations. So here's the things that I'm looking for my dogs or my teams to have before we start introducing the indication. So first and foremost, independent hunting, right? We want the dog to understand what their target odor is and that they are independently and confidently hunting for it without the handler in the picture. So can you stand at the start line and send your dog into an area and they can go look for odor? You can mark on first sniff for that, right? Can I sit in a chair and face away from the search area and have my dog go confidently search for odor? New areas, new contexts, all that kind of stuff, right? I'm even starting a little bit of my container searches at this point before I have like a full indication. I want my dogs to see a lot of pictures and I want them to be super confident. I also want my dogs to have the belief that odor always pays, right? So if you're following the odor pay system, we always want to prioritize odor first. And so I'm looking to make sure that the dogs in the system are really recognizing that before we start adding in the indication. And then finally, you as the handler need to have an ability to read your dog. So if you're not able to like read their change of behavior or understand like what it looks like as they're sourcing, then it's going to be super hard for you to have the right timing to start bringing this into your search. So you'll be able to train the strategies that we're going to talk about tonight away from the search area, but bringing that back into the search is a little bit more challenging if you can't read your dog. So really knowing your dog well. If you are struggling with that, my number one tip for that is just to make sure that you video all your training and review it with someone you trust, because it's so crazy to see things in the video that you just would never pick up on at the end of the leash. Okay, so we're going to jump into the strategies. So sustained hand touch is one great way to get stillness. And surprisingly, of all the behaviors that I taught my short-hair Vimy here, this was absolutely the hardest for him. I also had a lot of like weird behaviors where he was like licking or biting or nibbling or like weird things at the hide that I was like going like bananas with Natalie over. I'm like, oh my God, like what is he doing? It was super frustrating. And as soon as I took it away from odor and added the sustained hand touch, which honestly like was so painful to teach with him because he was never still. Like he was always like, you know, like picture a working cocker, but like 60 pounds, right? Like just constantly vibrating. We call him the hummingbird. And so this was super, super hard to teach him. But when we got it, holy man, it clicked. And it was like it was a big resource for us. So everyone's probably got like at least a bit of a nose touch or a nose target to the hand. All you're doing really is simply withholding your marker to build some duration. And I have a video here. I just actually took this really quickly tonight because I didn't have one of any of our students, but I'll just show you kind of like how we start that. So, and he still isn't like, this isn't his favorite exercise. You'll see him be like, nah, I don't want to do that. But I just kind of wait for him. It's the only way you're going to access reinforcement. And he's really clear on his markers. So he understands what's getting him paid. So in the first video, you'll see I'm just kind of like marking as soon as he touches my hand. And then in the second video, I'm actually using Zen hand or like a food hand, which we'll talk about a little bit later to sort of increase a little bit of duration and commitment on his part. So I'm just marking as soon as he touches my hand. And he's like faking it a little bit. So when he does that, I kind of just like pull my hand away a little bit to like make him push into it a little bit more. He gets really mad about it. So that's kind of just like the initial stages of it. And you're just going to start like withholding your marker a tiny bit more and a tiny bit more. But I find like you can see that one where he was kind of just like barely like touching my hand. He understands if I take my hand away that he needs to like find it again, right? And I find that that helps. Like if you like, you know, this is the dog's nose and they're kind of just like sort of grazing your hand. If I move it away and ask for the touch again, then typically they'll push in harder. And that's when I can reinforce that nice nose touch. So I like a little bit of like pressure when they're pushing on the nose, because I find that if you can get that pressure, then the duration will come quickly because you can just like, you know, withhold your reinforcement a little bit to get them to push into your hand. And then this video is just showing how I use a little bit of Zen hand to help increase his duration. And this is also a really great place to start proofing just like handler movement and stuff like that, which we'll talk about in the second part of this, but you can start it away from odor, any movement, right? Like he came off there, I just withheld my reinforcement. And you can see I use both a click and a verbal marker, and he's pretty clear on both of those. Perfect. So that's kind of what it looks like to teach the sustained hand touch. I really like this strategy because you can get away from odor completely. Like you don't have to use any odor. And if you have any like weird behaviors that you want to get away from, like the licking, biting, chewing, nibbling, all those types of things, which are really common in the beginning because like, you know, the hide's like right in front of the dog and they're like, ooh, what's this, right? They're just playing around. You can select away from that. And I had to with Vinny, like he was doing all the weird things. All right, so the next strategy is to use your odor pays box. So this is how we do intro for odor for most of our dogs. But even the dogs that join our system later on, they totally pick this up. You do not need an odor pays box. They're amazing. Highly recommend everyone gets one. I cannot believe the use I've gotten out of it, especially teaching classes. It's just like you can give so many different pictures to the dog. So, and it's really great because most dogs can't like paw it over or like knock it over, which if you have aggressive responses, it's really nice to take it to the odor pays box because it's a little bit heavier and they can't paw it and stuff. It also doesn't need to be the odor pays box. So just like those big blue Rubbermaids with like a nice like size porthole in the middle is also something that you can use for this. The objective here is for the dog to like put their nose in something, right? So this is just another way to shape that like nice nose freeze. And I love to have that little porthole in it because like the dogs really figure out super quickly to stick their nose right in there. And then you can start building duration from there. So again, like all of our other behaviors, when we're creating duration, one of the ways to create that duration is just to start withholding your reinforcement or withholding your marker so that the dogs understand that there's a little bit more required from them. I got a ton of frustration behavior with this method, and so it wasn't really good for Vimy, but lots of my student dogs pick it up super, super fast. So you're gonna just have to play with these strategies based on your dog. If you're seeing a lot of frustration behaviors, try something else and just see what works. We're also going to talk about Zen hand at the end of this, and that's also another one that I found for my personal dog. He really like got the concept of that, and anytime he was frustrated in a particular situation, I was able to use Zen hand, and he started to understand what was going on. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of videos here. This was from a workshop that we did last year on this topic, in fact. And the first one, I'm just basically marking as soon as the dog goes to the box. So mark on first sniff. And then for me, when the dogs are very first learning, I do like to do a little treat toss for the dogs because I find it creates that little pattern of where the dog goes away and then they reorient back to the box and then you throw the treat away and they reorient back to the box. In this case, Vimy was a little bit past that. He probably didn't need that, but for new dogs, it's a great way to kind of just get them ping-ponging back and forth. You could also use your location-specific marker. So you could feed at source here, or you could feed from hand. So there's no wrong answer. You kind of just need to base it on what your dog needs in that moment. Yeah, so pretty quick video, but you can see I'm just like, I'm not really looking for an actual nose freeze in that moment. I'm just selecting for the dog going to the box and putting his nose in there. People are like skeptical about how to build duration on this particular exercise, but remember that the more it's better to click in the beginning stages more frequently and give your dog a higher rate of reinforcement so they have value going to the box. If you do it the other way and like try to like get greedy and like hold out for a lot of duration in the beginning, some dogs like just get frustrated and leave and they don't want to come back, right? So you don't want to get into that situation. So if you have to like have a really high rate of reinforcement at first for your first few sessions on this, do that. Don't worry about it. And then quickly start selecting for a little bit more and a little bit more. And you'll see here, that's what we're doing. So you can see there, he's offering me just a little bit more duration every rep, and I'm just withholding my marker just a tiny little bit every time. So I'm not going from like 0.05 seconds to like 3 seconds in the first rep, right? I'm just basically slowly building that over a period of repetitions. And the high rate of reinforcement, believe it or not, helps the dog be committed to staying in the box. So it does really start to come together if you start selecting for that duration fairly early on. If you always, and I had gotten myself into this situation with Vinny early on, is that I was always marking on first sniff and never asking for any duration. And so I was just getting a lot of flybys on odor. So you do need to start this fairly early, but you can really like over several sessions start selecting for duration. So you don't need to do it all at once. Okay. And I don't know if you guys could hear the volume on that, but someone in the audience was just asking if I would prefer to feed from hand versus tossing the food. So my answer was, if your dog needs the food tossed, toss it for them. If they can eat from your hand or you can pay at source, do that instead. Probably now, if I had to do it all over again, I would probably pay at source, and I tend to have my students doing that more often as well. But that's what we had here in the video. Okay. This is our reverse pairing strategy. I love this for just like something that you can easily peel out of the search area. So there's still no searching, but we're bringing odor into it. It's a different context and a different visual for the dog than the odor pays box, right? We want to start changing that context and start helping the dog generalize that odor is what cues you to do your indication. But if we always stay on the odor pays box, it gets a little bit tricky to start transferring that over later. So this is a really fun way to just do that. Also, it takes the hunting right out of things, so you don't need to worry about whether your dog's searching or not. I feel like sometimes, even though I tell people like only just have the dog go to the odor pays box, like the dog's like off searching the environment somewhere, and you're like, no, that's not what we're doing. So it still happens. So this is a great method for anyone who's teaching classes. If you just like literally like hand everyone a glove and a tin with some odor in it and their cookies, and they can like go work in their little corners and like just start shaping their indication without having everyone like searching everywhere all over the place. Remember that odor pays. So it's always odor first, then the cookie. We're not putting the cookie on top of the tin. We're putting the cookie underneath the tin. So what ends up happening is that we're creating some anticipation for the dog that the cookie's underneath that tin, and that as soon as they put their nose on it, again, don't get greedy in the beginning, just mark on first sniff and lift that tin up so that the cookie underneath is exposed. And what that ends up happening is the dog is anticipating that cookie to appear, and so they'll hold their nose there longer and longer and longer. Slowly add duration until your dog is doing more of a sustained target, and then waiting for their marker. So same kind of thing as the rest of the strategies. I'm going to show you just a brief video here of doing this with Vinny. This was not a strategy that worked particularly well for him. It works really great for some of my students. Like every student will report back and say, oh, the hand touch was a no-go, but the reverse pairing was great. So you just got to play around with it and see what works best for your dogs. So yeah, pretty short clip there, guys, but you kind of get the point, right? Like even like in 3 repetitions, he was already starting to like hold his nose there a little bit more. And really what's super important, and this goes for all the strategies, but really make sure that you're selecting for what you want. I'm not clicking when his nose is like moving around all over the tin. And he was actually like trying to push the tin away to get the cookie. And like all of my like labs and golden retrievers in the world, like, you know who you are, like they're trying to like just push my hand out of the way to get the cookie, right? So make sure that you're selecting for the behavior that you want, which is the nose freeze on top, even if it's fleeting at first. But if your dog really like being persistent about trying to get that cookie, then just like mark initially and like get that tin off there and feed them as quickly as possible. Okay, so next strategy, and this isn't necessarily a strategy that I use independently, but it's something that I am combining with all of the other strategies here to try and get a little bit of duration. My dogs love Zen Hand. They totally understand what it means. I took a course with Sarah Bruschi a long time ago, and that's who I learned this through. Your dog has to understand Zen Hand before you start implementing it into this. So kind of just to like quickly explain that process for anyone who doesn't know what Zen hand is. It's a little similar to like It's Your Choice, where the dog needs to like leave the food to get the food, right? So we want to teach the dog that like you can get the thing in my hand if you leave it, and then I'm going to feed you the food from my hand. But we kind of like it kind of like takes the It's Your Choice a little bit further, in that we also can use that Zen hand so that when our hand is open, that means keep going. And when our hand is closed, that means try something else. So this is really great for dogs who want to offer a lot of behaviors. And if you can get clarity on this away from odor, and you have a dog that like, some dogs, like when you start shaping like the odor pays box, they're putting their feet on it and they're like doing like bucket spins on it and like all sorts of like random stuff. You can sort of eliminate that by teaching them the Zen hand first. Like, hey, like shaping an exercise means keep going with the hand open and try something new with the hand closed. And then the light bulb starts to kind of go on for them. I love this for pretty much any duration behavior. Stays, like nose targets, anything with to do with the odor. I use Zen hand for quite a lot in my training, but essentially it just means that your dog needs to leave the food in your hand to get the food in your hand. We, of course, want the dog to choose the odor versus the food in our hand. So what I end up doing when I start using this is I will present my hand to my dog, and if they go for it, I just quietly close my hand. And then once they go back to doing what I want, I open my hand and mark and feed the dog. So we'll look at another video here coming up where I'm using the odor pays box and the Zen hand early on with Vimmy's indication, because he was super frustrated and basically just like barking and biting and like doing all sorts of crazy things because he doesn't like duration. So that's what I started doing really to like make breakthroughs with him on his duration, was the Zen hand. But just remember that the closed hand equals go back to odor, open hand equals keep going with your duration at source. That's kind of the way I think about it. Let's have a look here. So my mechanics there could have definitely been a little bit cleaner. I was a little bit like flaky on the open hand versus closed hand. Lucky for me, my dog still got it. But you could see like I clipped this video initially before I was doing the Zen hand in this particular session. He was like barking and like running around and like all mad because he doesn't really know like what duration means. So as soon as I brought the Zen hand into it, it just like brought everything down and he was able to concentrate a little bit. And even though he was like mugging my hand a little bit, it's just because there was so much frustration in the session previous to that he was just like, I'm going to try anything at this point except for the thing that you want. He just did not understand what I wanted. So the Zen hand helps bring them down quite a lot. And I will even do this now if I want to create a little bit of duration in situations. So it's something that I use quite often still with all of my students and with my own dogs as well. So that kind of brings us to the end of all of the strategies. I just want to talk a little bit about like your progress and like practice of these types of things before we go to the Q&A. So I know I said this earlier, but don't be in a rush to incorporate these strategies. So you can work on the stuff that's away from odor and away from hunting. That's great. That's not going to hurt your hunting, but make sure that you really are having a confident and motivated dog before you start really bringing in the indication, like in any formality. When you start, take your time. Lots of people get super frustrated after like the second session and they're like, oh, my dog has no duration. Well, yeah, like they're learning and it's hard and they don't really understand what you want. So it's like any other behavior, you're not going to get it immediately, right? Like you don't get a competition obedience 5-minute out of sight sit stay in 2 sessions, right? Like it's the same concept. It seems, I don't know why in our human minds, we like oversimplify sport detection so much sometimes. This is one of those times where we like oversimplify and you're like, oh, my dog should just get it. I was totally one of those people. I'm like, come on, Vinny. But don't be worried. Your dog will get it. If your timing and your criteria is clear, they will get it. So just go at their pace. Remember to always be clear on the skill that you're working on in your session. So sometimes I set out to specifically work on my indication. Sometimes I set out to specifically work on like new areas or new contexts or new skills like converging or inaccessibles or whatever. So just always have a training plan for when you're going into these sessions, what you're actually working on. Your indication is like a muscle, use it or lose it. We talked a little bit earlier about how getting paid for a change of behavior will diminish their indication over time. But this is especially true if you trial a lot, and especially in organizations where you don't need to have an indication. So my teams that are doing a lot of SDDA trials, they typically have fairly solid indications that they're using quite a lot. But even still, like, and one thing that I didn't really like address earlier, which should have been brought up when we were talking about markers, is alert isn't your marker. And your dog, if you trial a lot, is going to start thinking that that's their marker because you are allowing that criteria at trial when you say alert and your dog comes off of odor and now you're paying them. Of course, that's like the little bridge in their mind that they're making. And so of course, now they think alert is their marker, right? So you really need to like then go back into your training sessions and really suss that out for your dog and provide clarity around what alert equals versus what your indication equals and what those markers sound like. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the next part 2 of this webinar, but I just wanted to mention it because it does come up quite a lot. And I see it happen all of the time at trial and in training where people are saying alert and their dogs are popping off of odor. So if we're doing that at trial and we're reinforcing our dog for that, you're of course just going to get more of that behavior, right? So just be aware of that and try to like really work on your indication as a muscle, as a separate skill. Everything in moderation. So like I said earlier, don't try and only focus on this particular skill in parallel. So like when I was teaching VIMIs, and this is what we do with my students, like even though we taught an indication class, we weren't just working on indication. Like, of course, we were working on other skills. And there were segments of the class where we like heavily focused on the indication, or we heavily focused on a piece of the indication within the context of that search area. But don't, overdo any one aspect of your training. You want to have everything in moderation and balance. And if all else fails and your dog is struggling, mark on first sniff. That's like always like your best fallback approach. You can go back and fix your indication later, but it's really hard to fix your confidence and motivation. So if you're over prioritizing your indication over the confidence and motivation bit, that's going to give you some trouble. So if you're ever unsure about what to do in a moment, oh my God, should I be marking for my indication or my change of behavior or whatever, just pay your dog for being at odor and fix the rest of it later. That's kind of the way I look at it. And that's how I tell my students to operate. So, and because we've dropped a few teasers about part 2 of this webinar, a couple of things that I think, first of all, it would have been like a 3-hour webinar in order to get through all of this stuff. So when I started making it, I messaged Natalie and I'm like, there's just no way, like everyone's going to fall asleep. So we need to definitely break it out. But I think also like these strategies are really important and you need to have the groundwork laid before we talk about all of this other stuff. But also, this is the big piece that people are missing when they start putting their indication back into searching. So how do we add it to new contexts? How do we add duration? And how do we add handler distractions like leash fumbling, dropping your clicker, calling alert, like just being ridiculous humans in the search area? How do we handle all of that and still bring up our indication to where we need it for trial, right? And so that's what we're going to talk about in part 2. I have tons of videos at least, and I'm going to probably poach some of Natalie's proofing videos also for that one if I can get her to send me some of Gus, because there's so many things that we can be doing with our proofing of the indication that will make this so strong and so bomb-proof, and you guys will be super, super happy with the results. If you just stop with these strategies, you're probably going to get a little bit more duration at source. That's probably a good thing for most people, right? But if you really want to take this to the next level and have a really proved, like rock solid indication, then part 2 will go into how we're basically bridging that gap between teaching these strategies away from odor and in these tiny little contexts to like building it all out into like a full search and how you manage all of that. So that's what we'll be talking about in part 2. And yeah, I think that's it. That's everything I have for you guys. So let us know if there's any questions in the chat and we will stick around and try and answer those the best we can.
Yeah, if you guys want to go ahead and go into the Q&A, and if we have any open questions, then we'll just kind of go through those. But thank you, Tamara. That was great. I really like the reverse pairing is a cool idea.
I learned that from you, so.
Yeah, I like that. And the biggest thing, you guys, is the reason that it's good to have all of these different kind of methods is because, as Tamara said, you're going to have to try some stuff and see what really clicks for your dog. So the more kind of tools you have in your toolbox that you can bring out, and for those of you that teach other people, of course, the more kind of different methods we might have to start introducing these concepts to our dog, the more kind of well-rounded that education will be. It looks like we're getting a couple of things coming in. Somebody's asking about part 2. It'll probably be a minute for part 2. Well, we'll have to kind of flesh that out, Peg, and let you know. We want to try to do it as soon as possible for you guys. It's just a little tricky because of my schedule, but we'll figure that out. But we'd like to have it out for you guys as soon as possible. But again, if you're brand new to working on an indication, as Tamara said, it's also going to be helpful that you work on these strategies, for the next week or two or what, till then. So that when we get to part 2, you can really start implementing those methods because you've already laid some of that foundation.
Yeah, for sure.
So that one is a TBD on the exact date. Yep. So Peg, that would be your sustained hand target, the Zen hand, and then we also went over that reverse pairing. Tamara, we have a question. When rewarding the hunt, when it is too difficult, are you giving that primary reinforcer or just a verbal continuation marker, or does it depend on what the dog is doing?
Yeah, kind of like in all dog training, it kind of depends. But like if I'm terminating the search, I might just give my dog their primary reinforcer and like put them up, and I might just say, yay, good dog, like let's end, right? I'm not going to mark them with my clicker like they're finding source, for example, but I'm just gonna be like, yay, all done, and that's my cue for like their toy. So I might just pull them off that way. You could keep going signal if you use something like that, like a good dog, kind of just like encourage them along. I found that that's been really helpful with Vimy, especially as we overcame some of his confidence issues. So I think for a dog who is lacking some confidence in a situation and they're working super hard to like source the hide, and you can see that they're sourcing, but maybe not really like pinpointing it, that's probably when I would use my my keep going signal or my continuation, like go go go. But if I'm like out in a search area and I can just see my dog is just like not having it and they're just not being successful, that's when I'm just going to give them their primary reinforcer and be like, let's get out of here, and we're going to go assess why that didn't work well, right? Do you have anything to add there, Natalie?
No, yeah, it definitely depends on the dog. As Tamara said several times, we're always kind of prioritizing the motivation and the confidence of the dog. So if they're working something out and you can kind of see that, oh, this is beyond, the hide was actually too hard and not quite the difficulty level we were trying to set up, and the dog starts really struggling and you see the motivation dip, there's a fine kind of line there. So on one hand, if the dog pushes through and is successful, that's a really good win because they worked through that difficulty and kind of that low and came back up. But on the other hand, if they don't end up figuring it out, or we start trying to come in and help them, that's not going to be helpful to our training. So, I always feel kind of, if you're seeing it not go well and the dog is not sourcing, or they just keep missing it, it's always going to be better to, take them away. Yay, good job. You tried, kind of thing. Again, it would depend on the dog if I were to give my primary or not. I think a lot of that kind of comes down to what's the dog's kind of attitude. So like I recently had a trial with Gus where I could see at the end of the run, it was a container search with some blowing odor, and he got a little confused and he was on the wrong box, and I called it and we got a no, which is not common for him in trial. And it really deflated him, and he's a very emotional dog, so he really responds to me, and it wasn't a big deal to me. I was like, okay, no big deal. But just him not getting that reinforcement that he was expecting, it really deflated him. And I think when it comes to some of that stuff, you have to kind of know your dog a little bit and decide what's sort of the lesser evil in that situation. And after that search with him, I kind of felt like, I'm never going to mark, of course, there's nothing to mark if your dog gives an incorrect response or, doesn't locate odor or whatever. But I still want to make it a good experience for them kind of as we leave the area. So yes, very dog dependent, but we're always going to prioritize our motivation and our confidence, kind of above all else. So I hope that answers that for you, Tori. And then there was another question, Tamara. Can you define first sniff? As the dog approaches the source, when do you say that's first sniff?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of depends on your hide placement, right? So that's a really good question because it's one of those things, again, for a sport detection or probably any detection really, that like it's a little bit sometimes intuitive. Like you have to look a little bit like at your airflow and like what's happening with your hide. And sometimes it's not always known to us what's going on. So if I see my dog is like sourcing something and he's just not getting any closer, I'm just going to mark probably at the like level of highest motivation or intensity in his searching and probably feed him if I know where the hide is, right? So like that's where like this is where you got to like be running a lot of known hides in these stages when you're trying to work on these types of things, because if I know where the hide is and he's getting as close as I think he can get given the conditions for the hide, that's where I'm going to mark. But if it's an unknown hide, like I have trained with training partners before where like I kind of knew generally where it was and I could just see like, oh, my dog is like his motivation's dipping. I'm just going to like mark here and then like get someone to come pay, like show me where it is so I can pay him and see if he'll go back to it or something like that. I'm not showing him where the hide is, but I might like resend him on a search again. And now that like he's kind of been marked once, that might give him a little bit more motivation to kind of stick out the tougher puzzle and go back to it. It's rare that I would do that, but typically I'm going to want to know where those hides are to be able to mark on first sniff. The other thing that we do when we want to practice running blind hides with our students is that we tell them to put up their hands instead of saying alert or using a marker at all when they feel that their dog is as close to the hide as they can possibly get. And then we would tell them to mark their dogs or not. And that's based up solely to the judge or the instructor's discretion as to what is close enough for that particular dog. But that's a really good method for our students to get some like blind hides under their belt without diminishing the confidence and the motivation of the dog and like losing any indication criteria. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that was great. And I usually tell people, when we talk about first sniff, I want to see that the dog has some recognition that like, wow, I'm at odor. Yeah. I'm not going to wait for the full duration indication, but I do want to see some recognition of like odor, because otherwise if we're going, oh, his nose was by it, but the dog's not really registering it, right? Like the dog's just doing a quick pass, but maybe they actually didn't take in odor. They didn't recognize that it was there. Yeah. And we're marking that. It's going to lead to a lot of confusion. So we do want to see, right, that the dog knows I'm here at odor. But we're just not waiting kind of for the rest of that chain. We're taking that first bit of like, wow, it's here. And then taking that instead of waiting for the dog to go, wow, it's here. And then settling into an actual indicator, their full indication. Yeah. And with a freeze indication, paying on sniff, a lot of times you are kind of getting your indication, but it's just super, super short, right? So that's one of the nice things about a freeze response is it's so easy to peel it back and have that little tiny criteria versus if you were training, something like a sit, like your dog's butt's either on the floor or it's not. But with a freeze indication, their nose is going to go there regardless of what other indication you might have. So it's really easy to start with that and go, your nose is here. I'm going to mark you for that. You have that recognition. And then start building your duration and all of those other factors. But yeah, that was a good question.
Yeah. I just want to add, Natalie, too, before you move on, that this is again why it's super important to understand what your dog's change of behaviors are, right? Because if you don't know that, you're gonna miss the moment that your dog is an odor when you should have marked on first sniff. And that change is gonna have come and gone, and the dog's gonna have left before you probably have a chance to mark them. So really knowing what your dog's changes of behaviors look like will be really critical there.
Yeah, and absolutely, it's so nice having an indication. It takes so much pressure off you as a handler, but it's not a reason for you not to learn your dog, right? Yeah. And Tamara was talking about videoing your sessions. If you're having a hard time reading your dog, videoing those sessions is so, so helpful. Read all that change of behavior. We did a little game on the Canine Talking Sense page where I just posted a bunch of videos. And I think this is a fun exercise that anybody could do. But I posted a bunch of videos of a handful of Gus's searches, but I cut off the sourcing part. So it was just him potentially working odor or working a blank room. And you're just trying to read, is my dog having change of behavior because there's odor, and now it's going to lead to a final indication or a response to odor? Or is my dog just kind of searching a room? And for some dogs that are maybe very kind of exuberant in just their natural way they work a space, it can be kind of hard to tell. And you really do have to hone in on these specific little nuanced things that they do when they're in a blank room with no odor, or when they are starting to work odor, and then that's going to lead into source. So definitely, even though you might have a really great indication, don't let that be kind of an excuse not to get really, really good at learning your dog's change of behavior, because it's still so important.
Yeah.
I actually don't see any other questions coming in.
Awesome.
I'm going to give you guys maybe another minute or two if there's something you haven't gotten answered. But otherwise, then we will wrap it up. Shara, I hope I'm saying that right, said she had to head out, but it was great. And she has some stuff she's going to implement. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Yeah, and also that that sustained hand target is super, super helpful for like a bunch of other stuff that has nothing to do with nose work or detection. Yeah. I use it for cooperative care, vet visits, all of that stuff. It's really nice to have that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you can like change that into a chin rest super fast too if you want to like, alter it for cooperative care or whatever. Yeah, they pick it up really fast. Once they start getting the duration on one thing, even too, I find, then like they figure out the duration on all the other things pretty quickly also.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, I don't see any other questions. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Tamara, thank you for doing this and giving us all the information. Watch for an email, you guys, that will give you dates on part 2. We'll figure that out and kind of get back to you guys. You will all have access to the recording. So just watch for that in your email, probably sometime tomorrow. And check your spam if you don't see it right away, because I swear it will be there. Thank you guys so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye.